Hello, this is Francesca Vigliani from Cloud Academy. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Today we'll go over some best practices to optimize AWS costs and govern at scale. I'd like to introduce you to HyperGrid's VP of Products, Badri Venkatachari, who will be leading this live session, showing us all how to streamline AWS operations with data and automation. Thank you for joining us today, Badri.
Thanks a lot, Francesca. Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. Certainly look forward to the session, and I think it's. And I'm actually joined on this topic by another person who's a customer of ours, and I'm hoping that there'll be a lot of insights for you guys to take away from this session in terms of your overall AWS adoption. So with that, let me just quickly jump into the agenda. So we've really broken it out into 4 sections. One is really focused on helping you think through how do you get into AWS, and that's really planning for AWS. The second section is going to be focused on optimizing your environment within AWS. The third and a very related portion of the conversation is going to be about governing, how best to govern. What does that really mean in terms of all of the different activities around it? And then finally, for the most part, a lot of customers in AWS use EC2 as a very, very big portion of their current spend. But we also see a lot of customers looking beyond EC2 at AWS Lambda. So we will be talking about serverless and some takeaways in terms of how you can think about optimizing your serverless environment if that's where you are. And we'll get into finally Q&A. So with that, to sort of unveil the mystery here, the customer is Burwood Group, and I'm joined by James Anderton, who is the DevOps Architect. James, do you want to quickly just introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is James Anderton. I work for the Burwood Group as DevOps Architect, and my passion is automating all things, both infrastructure and application oriented. And I'm presently really excited about the concept of modernizing traditional applications for cloud deployment. And I've shameless plug, currently have a few workshops centered around this, as well as containerization and Kubernetes. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about best practices and optimizing costs.
Thanks, James. Okay, let's dive right in. So the first one about planning for AWS. So, as you think about going into AWS, one of the things that becomes really important is for you to make sure that your journey in terms of a successful journey, one which actually ends up being especially on the cost side, right? Being well under budget, well under the targets that you might have set for yourself in terms of an ROI as part of your cloud migration project. And so from that perspective, it becomes extremely important that as you map your existing data center applications, that you take the time to plan it out. And what I mean by that is really using as much of automation, as much analytics in terms of getting insights on your existing environment, understanding the performance, understanding how much of your existing data center resources are used, and making sure that you're picking the right instance in AWS that best reflect not just a superficial mapping, but actually a deeper mapping that optimizes for both performance and cost, right? And the implication there, of course, is that if you chose the wrong instance, you would end up spending significantly more. And that's actually one of the most common problems that we see with a lot of enterprises who are looking to go to the cloud or going to the cloud. And the very first step that they take is one which just maps at a very based on just how much is allocated within that data center to what they need in AWS. And that's obviously not the best way to go about doing it. So as you think about your data center environment, there's really 2 pieces there, right? A lot of customers look at lift and shift. And so you're really thinking then about how do I take my existing VMs and move them into the cloud. Now, one of the things that is very, very important for you to do, even before you consider the movement into AWS, is for you to understand what you have on premises, understand what the utilization is, and right-size that environment. Turn off the things that you don't need, right-size the things that you're not using as much, or right-size right-size up if you feel like the performance that you're getting on-prem is for some reason suboptimal. So make sure that even before you map your existing environment to AWS, that you get your current environment to a point where the mapping actually makes sense, right? And so from that perspective, a good way to go about doing it is to rely on a bunch of tools. Hopefully you have some kind of an IT system of record, or something like a cloud management platform or a migration tool can really help auto-discover your existing resources, help you give you the insights that you need in terms of understanding what that environment looks like, and then helping you right size and clean up. And in some ways, this actually maps to a common framework that people think about when they think about cloud migration, which is the 6 R's or 5 R's, depending on how you look at it. It's really about retiring the resources that you don't need. You then decide to retain certain resources. And as part of the cloud migration, you think about rehosting, and that's really about taking a VM and mapping to the cloud. In some cases, you might decide that you might want to re-platform, where you might eliminate some operating systems. You might want to go to open source, or in some other cases, you might actually want to re-architect the entire application, where you still have the structure in place. If you will, it's a 2-tier app or a 3-tier app, still have the structure, but then you then think about having different cloud services that are part of the target footprint. So, but the key here is to use automation, not using Excel, manually going through the process of creating that system of record and mapping out the cloud resources is not the most optimal way to do it. And that also using automation also gives you that insight that you need to make sure that the performance mapping to the cloud is most optimal. And needless to say, that can save several thousands of dollars as part of the process, right? So you have to think about it in really 2 ways. One is the simple infrastructure lift and shift, and then the second is really about application planning, right? And this actually takes a much more nuanced approach, where you might have just standalone VMs. That earlier mechanism certainly makes sense. But when you think about a lot of the enterprise deployments, you typically have VMs talking to each other, right? And so when you plan for migrating this application into a cloud, you have to pick the instances, you have to pick the region, and so it's important then to understand the dependencies that a bunch of different VMs have, so that when you actually execute the migration, you're executing the migration on that group of VMs rather than on an individual VM. That has significant implications to the overall cost, because doing anything suboptimal, like not recognizing the dependencies, could mean that you end up making choices in the cloud which either under-allocate or over-allocate resources, which in turn has huge implications to cost. So treat the application as a group of VMs, understand the dependencies, make sure that you're then mapping to the cloud footprint for all VMs in that application together instead of separately. And that also avoids the inadvertent problem where you might end up moving one VM to some region and a bunch of other VMs to some other region, right? And that's not ideal at all, or one AZ and another AZ. And those things can have significant impact to costs as well as performance. And so, again, going back to the notion of analytics and automation, it's really important that you think about how best to leverage analytics or platforms that bring in analytics and automation to the entire process, so that you can not only think of the cost as you think about the cloud footprint, but costs in the time it takes to execute this entire exercise, right? It's not just about saying this is my footprint. It's also about saying, how do I compress what typically ends up being a 3-month, 6-month process down to a few hours or a few days, depending on how big your environment is, because then it sets you up for success at the very beginning of it, which then translates into a much less cost in terms of actually executing the migration and a greater chance of success there. Okay, so James, I have a question for you here, right? So what are the issues you've seen that prevent organizations from following these best practices for planning AWS instances and services from your perspective?
That's a great question. So from my experience, It's something along the lines of the business gets started developing what they see as a solution without IT involvement, and usually with good intentions, and trying to achieve speed to market, but wind up with an over-engineered solution from a vendor recommendation or an under-engineered solution based on pure guess. And the second critical piece is that organizations try to treat the cloud as an extension of their legacy data center, but also apply legacy management to it. The cloud, as you said, requires automation. To see the benefits of that marketing sold you, you have to automate, whether it's, automating startup and shutdown of test and dev, or constant right sizing, or resource-based auto scaling. And then lastly, don't forget that you're trying to solve a business problem. This is one of the key tenets of DevOps that we talk about is we're not using tools to do a thing. We're trying to solve a business problem. We're not migrating a server. We're moving an entire app stack, not just a pile of instances. So use PaaS services where you can. Think about data locality, data transfer, and so on. And hypercloud's modeling features help keep this front and center. The fundamentals of ITIL, like resource planning and service catalogs, are still sound in the cloud, even though people think they're dead. Service catalogs allow the user to provision something they understand, like an app, not just an instance of XYZ size.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so moving on, in terms of optimizing your existing AWS environment. Right, so you've seen this, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. You get into AWS and you create your accounts, and very quickly you realize that what you thought was going to be your cost for the first year, it's not, or for the first month even, it's not. And very often that ends up creating a lot of issues with respect to the cost piece of it, because frankly, you're then in a position where someone comes and says the budget isn't there. I mean, there's just not enough money to spend on this stuff, and so you probably have to either turn it off or go and do something else, and that becomes a big problem. And so it's really important for you to approach this proactively. And the other thing is, you have to think about the fact that just the sheer number of combinations that you have access to in the cloud is enormous, right? And again, going back to this notion of automation, you have to think, as you think about that first step, where you're mapping your applications to the cloud, and making sure that you're able to fine-tune any specific VM or any specific application to a point where you're able to specify requirements in terms of CPU memory, storage, network bandwidth. It's important for you to then recognize that mapping all of those variables to the cloud and getting it right is a very, very important part of optimizing your AWS environment. I mean, whether or not you came from your data center or whether you're just born in the cloud and you decide to do all your development in the cloud, looking at this problem as continuous, recognizing the number of variables and really understanding the need to then leverage automation and analytics is a very, very important part of optimizing your AWS spend, right? So there's the complexity is best addressed by thinking about tools and platforms that can really help you get the insights quickly that you need so that you can optimize it. And there's always a question about native tools or CMP, and you have native tools typically giving rudimentary functionality, something that allows you to get started, especially if you're just creating accounts on your own. But if you want to be part of a larger larger organization where you're streamlining this process, then CMPs provide a much broader set of functionality, which allows you to operate and integrate, frankly speaking, with a larger organizational framework, making your life easy as you think about your going and doing what you need to do in the cloud, which is really build apps and drive innovation for the business, and leave the other parts of making sure the day-to-day stuff that someone needs to do to potentially a different ops team. So the first thing, like I said, the complexity means that a lot of the decisions that you make with respect to optimization has to be data-driven. You need to constantly understand what have you deployed, how is it being used, which ones are not being used. I mean, oftentimes we see customers come back and say, well, I didn't even realize there were these 100 VMs or 200 VMs that were all running because somebody stood them up and forgot that they were there and just walked away, right? Or that someone picked an instance that they just wanted to make sure. A lot of times, as you ramp up on the public cloud, people take the safe approach, which is, well, I don't really know what performance I'm going to get. And of course, in the cloud, you have different processor generations, all kinds of variables, right, that contribute to variations in performance across different instances. So you take this. It's not necessarily wrong to take the safest approach, except that there is a pretty big implication in terms of cost. So understanding, getting insights from your existing cloud environment, and always staying on top of how much is being used, where can I optimize, where can I turn off, where can I right size, is a very, very important part of Think Smart, right? And so investing in cost management solutions, CMPs certainly do a great job of allowing you to optimize your AWS environment. AWS, of course, has its native tools as well, but in many cases, as you think about sort of the larger organizational framework and having both having a seamless DevOps process, then becomes important to adopt something more comprehensive. The second part is really around proactively managing costs from a budgeting standpoint, right? And so there is a cost element, and there you're thinking about constantly right sizing and making sure you're effectively spending a dollar. In this case, you're really thinking about making sure that for whatever spend you have, that there are some guardrails in place, right, from a budgeting standpoint. And so being able to oversee and address problems so that when somebody spends more than they should, it's caught. It's flagged. There is a workflow around it. Either there is an approval process or there is probably some kind of turning off of resources. There might be spikes, and so it allows you to actually manage it. So you may not have a problem on a regular basis, except during some months of the year or some weeks of the month, some days of the week, kind of a thing. An important part of this budget management process is to be able to consolidate your billing across the organization. And that's where you might have standalone accounts, right? Where everyone signs up for AWS, they have their own standalone accounts, but having those standalone accounts then roll in as member accounts under a master account, right? A master account, think of it as an account for the entire organization, and then a whole bunch of member accounts. Minimally, that kind of a structure allows you to consolidate the billing and see it all in one place. Of course, AWS organizations, again, is a great way for you to think about structurally having a framework in place where you have this notion of organizational units, and you have a high-level master account, you have organizational units, you can have multiple accounts under each OU. But the key there is being able to not only just track everything together, but also have policies that then can easily apply, that can be applied at one level and then flow down to the individual account. So you can apply a policy at the OU level and just flows down to all of the accounts there. And so having that kind of a framework-based approach, one that is either from something like an AWS organization or using a CMP, but one that allows you to scale this entire process is really important. So look at it holistically, look at it as an organizational framework, not necessarily one that is localized to individual account use. This is a very, very important part. Reservations provide a great way for you to take something that is very repetitive, that is prevalent in terms of usage in your organization, and drive tremendous cost savings. And the way you would go about doing it is to look at what kind of instances are being deployed on a regular basis, right? And of course, there is the point that the process that you follow to get to a point where you get comfortable buying things up front. It certainly takes a little bit of time, but the larger point here is in on-demand, where you just pay for whatever instance you have whenever you need it. Reservations are a direct contrast to it, where you could pay upfront, either partial upfront or fully upfront, and get cost savings by virtue of the fact that you're making that upfront commitment for the same instance, right? But before you can make those, you need to have a very good understanding of the landscape of the instances that are used in your organization. And in many cases, you have you take some time to sort of converge on a group of instances that make the most sense across your organization for different needs that you have. Needless to say that different groups do different things and have different requirements for their applications, but it's important for you to build insights and constantly monitor to understand what instances you have in your organization, and then try to see if making upfront commitments on those instances is a good way for you to save money. Keep in mind, making upfront commitment means that you're putting up money, and if you don't use it, you lose it. And so it's very important to, and that's why the insights and the analytics around RI is extremely important. The other part of this is how do you start, right? Start small is how we normally recommend to customers. Start with a small group of RIs, see if it makes sense. And convertible RIs, and even within RIs, you have convertible RIs and standard RIs. Convertible RIs have a lot more flexibility. They give a little less discount, still a pretty substantial discount compared to on-demand. They give a little less discount than the standard RIs, but they give more flexibility in terms of being able to use any instance in that family or in that region and that kind of thing, right? So it's important for you to then think about starting with convertible RIs perhaps on a small set of instances and then grow. And then as you get comfortable about the savings that you're seeing from those, then move to standard RIs, right? And so that's a great way for you to break down the problem, make it small, and make it trackable. But the key here is to keep on getting insights. And it's very important for you to make sure that if you're buying RIs, to use them and separate the ones which are probably temporary and they come in and go out from the more permanent and systematic deployments that you do in the public cloud, which can then benefit from the reservations in AWS. Okay, so question for you, James. What challenges have you experienced in helping organizations get their arms around optimizing their cloud after they've started deploying workloads there?
Yeah, so, the first challenge, it's as much about buy-in as it is actual optimization, because without buy-in, we're not going to be optimizing anything. But what we're seeing is the business or teams using cloud provider portals fear having them taken away. They fear loss of choice and control. And this needs to be dealt with by working with the teams to figure out, what their most used items are and creating self-service blueprints for them. And this is where, the plugin system for in HyperCloud really shines, and where we at Burwood can deliver the value add is being able to add in all the different kinds of things that the users and teams need to be able to do. As the cloud providers are iterating at a staggering rate, and no one company can keep up with all three of them, but we can develop a library of integrations based on what our customers most frequently use. And on the governance side is IAM and RBAC. And, we find that most often cloud accounts are started by the business rather than corporate IT, or created by corporate IT, but delegated directly to the business. And oftentimes speed and lack of manpower wins over best practice. And this is where HyperCloud comes in handy with compliance checks and remediation, as well as its own layer of, IAM and RBAC if you choose to use it as your self-service portal. Thirdly is creating cloud billing account sanity. Having a bunch of disparate accounts created by shadow IT makes optimization or visibility of any sort really difficult. Getting the different departments to talk to each other and work out a reasonable plan for account and billing permissions and boundaries is key. And this is where a CMP can create clarity where native tools struggle. And, around the RIs, it's really key to create a policy of here's what we want to achieve. So we want to achieve, 80% of our production workload is covered by, reserved instances, and then work towards it and make sure that you put that at the very beginning of your onboarding for new applications. What do you expect this application to use, and profile it. Profiling is probably one of the last things that dev teams like to do, but it's key in some of the cloud native areas.
Yeah, that's really helpful, James. Okay, so moving on, let's talk a little bit about governing your AWS environment. And so the problem statement here is not just governance for governance sake, right? One of the things that is really important as you think about the public cloud is, and we see this with a lot of our customers, is how do you do governance in a way that it does not reduce the speed of innovation? Because ultimately, the reason you want to be in the public cloud is because you want to accelerate your innovation, get your apps out there faster, and have really not have to deal with the operational overhead that has typically plagued data center deployments. And so then the question and the key problem statement is, how do you achieve governance at scale without sacrificing flexibility and, frankly, the speed of innovation? So the first thing, and this is what you see here is AWS best practice, right? Your organization should emphasize the creation of clear, effective policies and governance mechanisms around cloud deployment, usage, and cost responsibility. What this is really saying is that, like I was saying before, governance is an organizational responsibility. It's not. It is something that needs to have buy-in from all the stakeholders, and the well understood mechanism and the framework for how an organization approaches governance. What are all the different parameters for governance that would be tracked? A clear roles and responsibilities in terms of who does it, right? And so all of that is very, very important to have in place. Otherwise, you're going to end up in this finger pointing like you see on the graphic there, right? And so you definitely don't want that. And the implication is the lack of a proper framework and a well-accepted approach to governance in the public cloud means that you're going to have constant back and forth between different teams trying to supposedly think they're not responsible for it, right? And that's going to end up resulting in a whole lot of wastage, budget overruns, very, very poor hygiene. All of the things that you can then benefit from in terms of cost savings are not going to be had, which means your cloud project is that much more likely to fail, right? And again, you need to think hard about, from a governance standpoint, AWS native tools versus CMP. Each has its own place, if you will. Typically, what we see again is when customers go to the public cloud, they start with native tools as putting their toes in the water. But once it starts requiring a more organized approach, CMP certainly have a pretty important role to play in helping you get there. Best practice one, govern collectively, right? This I want to spend some time talking about this from an RI perspective. I talked about how RIs provide a great way for you to save money by aggregating your usage across a few instances which are used extensively versus some others which see very little use or varying levels of use, if you will, that makes predictable purchasing around those instances much more difficult. This places emphasis on the fact that from an organizational standpoint, you can do much better, even better than if you did RI management at an individual account level, right? And what that means is when one group has a bunch of accounts that they're using, they may do some level of RI management. That's still local optimization. Having the ability to make RI procurement central means that you're not only going to look at the usage patterns of a single group, but multiple groups and potentially distributed across multiple regions, right? And so then you're able to build a very accurate model in terms of what are the instances, what are the instance types, which regions should I purchase them in, and come up with an optimized model which works much better across the board rather than just in individual groups. And so, for this to happen, you need to make sure all stakeholders are involved. They're able to report back on what their usage looks like. Frankly, the group that is responsible for procurement needs to be able to understand usage across groups, individual groups, over historical usage as well, so that then they're able to make the right decisions, right? And then combined with using master accounts means that you are truly able to get the benefits of RI at a global level. And in many cases, what you will find is that you consume services and you consolidate billing. The other important piece is the volume discount that you get from any provider, right? So there is the RI piece, but even generally speaking, for any given provider, consolidating and doing procurement at the highest level means that services and billing is done at that level, which potentially means that you could qualify for much bigger discounts than if you did local optimization. This I cannot emphasize enough. Best practice 2, tagging. Tagging is perhaps one of the most powerful ways to ensure that you're not only tracking costs, but you're able to do a whole lot of analytics around understanding who's using, where, how much, what does the historical look like, being able to do show back and charge back, and where you're seeing spikes, why are the spikes happening. It's really giving you a very rich set of insights in terms of patterns of usage, particularly as they pertain to cost, and setting you up in a much better way to remediate, right? So and you can do it one of two ways. Certainly making sure that your resources are tagged at a basic level, right? You could say, look, every resource needs to have 1 or 2 tags. Identifying resources that are not tagged and flagging it to individual users is very important, so that then the tags are attached. Also, what is important is not just looking at tagging as this one is perhaps not a centralized function. There is some minimum level of tags that an organization might need, but really allowing users to also participate in this process actively, so that then they understand why the process of tagging on an individual account level or a group level is important for the overall health of the governance practice within the organization is also important. So define tags, or maybe even tag templates, where you say every resource in this region has to have minimum of these tags, right? So then people are not left guessing about which tags. You might tell them that you need a tag, but they may not be clear on which tag. So helping them understand which tags and how they sort of roll up in terms of the overall dashboards that you maintain from a governance standpoint is very, very important. And then the next step, of course, is remediating, where you see issues, you're able to remediate them, you're able to address them, and that's a great way for you to make sure that there is a continuous process of enforcement in terms of not just the tagging, but the larger cost management exercise that tagging helps do. And then the third is about user autonomy, right? So you always think about, okay, budgets. What does that really mean? While you really want to think about a central way to manage budgets and quotas, we talk about AWS organizations, we talk about master accounts, being able to set budgets at the account level. In some cases, you might even want to set a budget at the service level, individual service levels, because you might say, look, we've seen typically that these are the services that spike, and I want to make sure that these services don't get consumed beyond a certain point because it's really, really expensive. So, but for you to have that kind of flexibility around for quotas and entitlements, you really need to make sure that there is a separation of concerns in terms of what is done centrally as well as what is done at the user level, right? And so typically you want to assign budgets at the individual account level, so then users are constantly being made aware of how much they can spend, how they're tracking against their budgets. But then also on an overall roll up in the organization, you are able to see how you're doing organizationally. CMP is a great way to make sure that this happens across the board. CMPs do a really good job of making sure that you can build the guardrails in a very flexible way. And some of the things that I talked about, even in terms of tagging, I think CMPs do a really good job of making sure that you're able to implement the governance practices at scale. And that's really what this comes down to, right? When you're doing it at an individual level, at a single account level, perhaps it's tenable for you to use some of the tools. But as you think about scale, as you think about repeatability, being able to go through an audit process that's easy to consume, dashboards, I think CMPs do have a role to play there in helping you set this up for the organization and scale. And certainly, again, the last point is it is important to think of empowering the end users. They need to be aware of the role that they play in making sure that the overall governance model is healthy, and it's not just because it's executed as a central function that individual end users don't have a role to play. They must understand the things that they are responsible for. Again, the goal here is to make sure that It provides the tools to do it easily in a way that does not take away from their core focus on innovation, but having them be aware of it is a very important part of achieving success. And finally, about shared governance and security, right? And this is again, is a sort of an extension of the previous slide here, where it is very important to democratize insights. And the more you're able to share with the organization and individual groups and users about how they are doing in terms of contributing to the governance, and what are the guardrails that they're not doing well on, what are the parameters that they're not doing well on, is going to ensure, is going to probably drive more success than if they were not aware, right? And so lack of awareness is one of the most often cited reasons that we've seen with customers, where when they get started down this path, either the IT team tries to just do it themselves, or there is sort of this loosey-goosey handshake between the ops team and the dev team, and it's not really clear who does what. And so just bringing the insights, sharing with everybody, sharing the dashboards, and making sure that there is a process of continuously establishing your governance posture. And I say security posture here is sort of a slight tee off from governance, because having your environment secure is an important part of how you make sure that the business risks and the costs associated with potential data breaches and security are kept to a minimum, right? And so that's why security is sort of this adjunct, if you will. I mean, in many cases, it's its own pillar, but thinking of security, thinking of best practices, thinking about insights all the way down to individual users is very important. And security does, and giving them an understanding of how they're doing on their existing environment from a security standpoint, also make sure that the cost implications of the business risk are appropriately handled throughout the organization. Okay, so question again, James. What are the best ways to institute guardrails without organizational friction, especially from a DevOps point of view?
Yeah, so one of the primary tenets of DevOps is to increase feedback. And this is critical to the agile process and to creating the culture required for a high-performing team. So we can ease friction by proactively relaying costs versus quota information via dashboards for your team's weekly stand-ups, or Slack and email integration, or for immediate notification, or action via bots. Anecdotally, one of my team members was working in, a CI tool, and they happened to see that, we had a little flag on the side that said, this container contains so many vulnerabilities. And it popped up the question, hey, what's this? And it got our engineering manager to actually go, you know what? We really should be paying attention to those, and let's figure out how we can add that to our next sprint. So just by having a badge on a dashboard, it enabled the correct behavior. Putting the right policies and processes in place for the right class of users will make the easy choice the right choice. And that's kind of like the example I just showed. Enabling self-service experience that people are used to with the cloud, but helping create good behavior passively via those guardrails. And then, API integrations will be critical. Some users will be fine using the self-service portal, and others, particularly engineers, won't want to deal with that, and they want their command line. And if you can offer API integrations via plugins to kick off different processes or blueprints, you can ease friction, allow them to work in the environment they're most comfortable with. And this is the power of a well-architected CMP platform.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems like there's got to be a big handshake, right, James, in terms of DevOps, Dev and Ops, in terms of making sort of the topics that we just covered. Cost management and governance is such it depends so much on the handshake between those two teams, and having more insights, more dashboards, more automation really seems like the way to go in order to make sure that the information is surfaced up at the right level and makes it easy for someone to both consume as well as initiate action as appropriate, like the last example that you were giving, James. Okay, so stepping outside EC2 a little bit, right? We see a lot of customers today, mostly in the EC2 realm, that pretty much covers most of what they're doing from a DevOps standpoint. But as enterprises and developers look for faster ways to do things, there's clearly a move towards serverless computing, right? And for a lot of those folks who are just coming up to speed on serverless, it's really about making sure that you don't even have there with EC2, you really determine the instance type and you determine the OS, and you have choices around those. Serverless is really one step further out where you're just simply looking at defining, having writing a bunch of code and handing it off to a framework to just execute and return the results. Of course, as part of that, you're going to have not just invocations around the serverless. It does interact a lot with a bunch of other components within AWS. And I think Simple Notification Service, SNS, SQS. And so there is a whole bunch of ecosystem services that then support the overall execution, especially as you think about one execution interacting with another execution and there being some kind of a workflow from one to the other. And so that's certainly something that a lot of people are looking at. From an operational control standpoint, it means less operational control, which traditionally has also allowed the innovation to become faster, the development to become faster. But it does come with its own sets of challenges. For one, apart from the technology itself, there is a pretty big difference in terms of how you price serverless. And so we'll get into some of that stuff. So when you think about Lambda pricing, specifically from an AWS standpoint, it is done on a GBSec basis. And what that is a combination of the amount of memory that you allocate. So the way you set up a serverless AWS Lambda function is by indicating the amount of memory that you need to execute that function, right? And that is internally translated by AWS into a CPU allocation. And you also then are charged by the duration of execution of that function. So that's why the GBSec. And what that means is you need to think about this in two different ways. One is, as you think about right-sizing your environment, you have to think about both aspects of execution in order to truly come to a point where you see that you're saving costs, right? It's not just enough to assume doing one is automatically going to do the other. There might be opposing outcomes. For example, if you reduce the memory, depending on how much the function truly needs, you might actually end up extending the duration, and so you may not save money. So it's important. It's also important for you to track and make sure that the overall health of invocations of your Lambda functions is monitored constantly, because poorly architected Lambda deployments will end up costing more. You will end up running a lot of functions that don't complete and paying a whole lot of money for stuff that frankly has not delivered much value to your business, to your development teams, and so on. And so the first practice is really about making sure that you are able to monitor all of your Lambda functions for every invocation. And the reason you need to monitor invocations is because you need to understand the statistical patterns that your functions are following, so that you're able to make the best, you're able to take the best actions in terms of optimizing your Lambda functions. And so, for example, understanding the period of your execution as well as the amount of memory consumed against the allocated, and looking at them side by side is going to be important to see if you reduce the memory. And so let's say you allocate a gig of memory and you're consuming only 256 megs, right? What that means is certainly there is an argument to be made to reduce the memory. But then once you do it, depending on the specific requirements of the function, you might have a slightly extended duration. And so any changes made, it's important to look at both those levers against memory allocation and execution, so that then you're able to see, hey, I reduced my memory and my execution time didn't go down. So, okay, so that makes sense, because then I can be confident that I'm saving money. And oftentimes you also see that as you go through the life cycle of a function, if you will, there is code written and rewritten and redeployed. And that's why it becomes that much more important for you to track these variables simultaneously to make the right decisions, right? But it's certainly, and CMP again is the CMPs that track this, provide the statistical views. They track Lambda functions that run through completion, Lambda functions that end up in errors, making you understand what the health looks like. And so you can then go and look at the functions that are not completing, that are erroring out or whatever, fix them. So then you can make sure that you're spending your money the right way for things that are valuable for your overall business. And again, given that an organization can have, as you think about a dev environment, you can have multiple Lambda functions, multiple groups, and so tracking it all together requires a fairly sophisticated platform like a cloud management platform that has both the intelligence, the automation, and the analytics for you to make the right decisions on cost savings. Okay, so what are the gotchas that have to be kept in mind before going to serverless? And how do you advise developer groups thinking of serverless versus containers during their cloud planning? James?
Yeah, so the difference between runtime and memory use can't be understated. Serverless is fundamentally for short-lived functions. And, a prime example is we were working on bringing in a data set from a legacy SOAP API. And at the beginning, they were continuing to use legacy data access methods, and management paradigms, and it was causing really long runtimes. And we decided to take a new perspective and to try to use something like pandas, and it solved that. It drastically dropped the runtime, and so optimizing your code accordingly is really key for maximum savings. And then secondly, remember what your function is talking to. Hitting a storage bucket thousands of times per minute via a Lambda function might be more elegant, than other solutions, but it's not necessarily the best use of your money. And to best manage the hybrid cloud world we live in, expect to be running workloads both in the cloud and on-prem, and prepare your environment to do the same with serverless. Using things like AWS Outposts and on-prem Kubernetes via EC2 instances, you can run serverless via Knative, the same as you could run it on Kubernetes via EKS. And you could have the option of moving a workload that you find is not quite ideal for the cloud after all. And Kubernetes runs the same, on-prem, off-prem, public cloud, AWS, Google, Azure, there it runs the same. And so this is, key for being able to move things around. And this brings up again where cloud management platforms really come in handy to help keep it all straight. The native tools, they'll get you about 60% of the way, but a good CMP is really useful. And to tie it up, serverless versus container questions are really about using different tools to solve different jobs. You have to go back to thinking about what it was designed to do. Event-driven processing, and to be the glue between pieces of functionality or business processes.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Okay, so I think with that, we pretty much come to the end of the session. So maybe we can take a few questions.
Of course. Thank you to both Badri and James. That was extremely insightful. We have about 10 more minutes, so time for just a couple of questions. The first question is for James. Is governance and cost management the same thing? If not, what additionally should I be thinking about when I say governance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in my mind, there is a difference. Cost management is pretty self-explanatory in that it's monetarily focused. But governance is much broader. Excuse me. It includes things like who can do what, with what, and when, as well as enforcing policy and practices.
Perfect. And the next one is for Badri. AWS native tools versus third party. Why should I pay more for an additional cost management tool when AWS already has options?
Yeah, great question. This is something that we get a lot from customers. Some of it we covered in the presentation. It really comes down to what are you trying to do and at what level, right? And what we've seen typically is when you get started with AWS, the native tools provide a good starting point. But the challenge that we see customers run into is how do you then scale it, right? How do you make sure that you're able to then set up a framework that, frankly, a lot of users across the organization are comfortable with? How do you make sure that you have the dashboards? And in many cases, the problem statement, frankly, goes beyond AWS, and they might be looking at a couple of different environments as well. So for all those reasons, it really it comes down to what is the level of sophistication you're looking at? What is the scale? Are you at a point where there is enough of sponsorship to look at this organizationally across the board, different groups, different geos, a whole bunch of accounts, and the need to then centrally manage it? If that's the problem statement, then we've seen customers really evolve into adopting cloud management platforms or cost management tools. And in the early stages is when they sort of put their feet in the water with the AWS native tools for the most part.
Okay, thank you. There's one last question, and it's still for you, Badri. How often should I relook at my instance strategy? How and where do I start?
Yeah, so great question. So the first step is, of course, if you've gone mostly on demand, a good place to start is really your build. And look at, again, there is the local optimization piece that we talked about, and there's a global optimization and across different groups. But at least minimally, what you can take a look at is what are the instances that you're using on an on-demand basis. And the other part of this is, are these for temporary workloads or permanent workloads, right? And so even where you might have a lot of temporary workloads, if you're reusing an instance type, that provides pretty good basis for you to consider capacity planning from a reservation standpoint. And then so your starting point is really some of the native tools. It does help you understand what do the usage patterns look like. And then up-leveling it and saying, okay, so how do I then apply this towards all of the groups? And this is where the handshake between the ops team and the developer teams become very important. But how often? It has to be continuous. I mean, typically what we see customers do is they take a month, they monitor every month, in some cases actually every week, to see if there are big deviations, because there are two parts to it. One is understanding what you're using so that you can buy the right RIs, if you will, or do the right capacity planning. The second part is understand if there are deviations from what RIs have been purchased, so that you can minimize or eliminate wastage. Because you certainly don't want a case where you look at 3 months, 6 months, you look at the patterns, look at the instance types, buy a bunch of RIs and forget about it, only to realize the next 6 months people have been doing something else, right? So you don't want that. So there is both a reason to keep doing what you're doing, or see if you need to buy more of the same, or make sure that there is no wastage by asking users to, by requesting users to use the RIs that have been purchased, so you minimize the overspend on the RIs and maximize, frankly, the utilization and the discounts that you get there.
Awesome. And with that answer, we conclude our webinar. So thank you to both Badri and James for being with us today. If you'd like to reach out to HyperGrid, here's on the last slide. You can find their email address. They will be happy to answer any other question. And in the follow-up email we will send with the recording, we will also add the ebook that you can then download directly from there. And a special thanks to everybody that joined us. If you have any other questions, you can reach out either to HyperGrid or even to Cloud Academy if it's anything related to cloud training. We will upload the recording also on our website in the webinar section, where you will also be able to find all the previous sessions. Thank you again. Bye-bye.